Our next speaker in our ZenFest today is Harry Haladjian. Am I pronouncing your name? Close enough. Harry is a postdoctoral fellow at the University Paris Descartes. He's working with Patrick Kavanagh in the Laboratoire de Psychologie de la Perception. Close enough. He got his PhD under Zenon's supervision at Rutgers here in 2011, along with a certificate in the cognitive science program. He has published widely with research looking at visual awareness, visual memory, tracking, enumeration, and several other topics. Of special note is he had a fantastic book that came out last year called Consciousness, Attention, and Conscious Attention, focusing on the relationship between those words. And I think he is the only speaker today who I think began his career studying tobacco marketing, which may or may not be part of the talk this morning. So please welcome Harry.
Thank you for the introduction, Brian. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's a great honor to speak in celebration of Zenon's work for his honor. And what better way to honor Zenon than by talking about myself? So let's give you a little bit about my background, the research I did at Rutgers, my postdoc research, some of the philosophical stuff that I've been getting into, and the Zen influence. So Zenon's influence is basically a thread throughout my work, clearly.
The microphone.
Should I do the microphone? Am I not loud enough?
Tell to that person.
Hello. I think I could try to. So my background, basically, I did an undergraduate degree at Boston College in philosophy and psychology. Back then, I used to want to be a philosopher. And before going back to graduate school, I did some research at Stanford University, where I did a lot of work in public health research, studying tobacco marketing and how advertising affects behavior, completely different than what I was doing now. And basically, I read a lot of philosophy on the side at that point, and that made me realize I do not want to go to grad school for philosophy. I also came across this book, which kind of gave me a direction of where I wanted to go, and Zenon's book on seeing and visualizing was like a perfect way to answer philosophical questions through empirical research, or that's what it kind of made me realize, and so that's why I went to Rutgers to study cognitive psychology under Zenon's mentorship in 2011. So at Rutgers, I did stuff like multiple object tracking, which I'm sure you can do this task really well. I looked at object-based attention, and subitizing and spatial memory. So we're not going to get into all the work that I've done, but I'll just mention that some of the projects I did here include a collaboration with Dana Chesney, who's here. I didn't realize he was here. And one of the earliest collaborations I did was with Carlos Montemayor, which is probably one of the best things that happened by coming into Rux, is having the different exposure to the different people from different fields that you somehow click with some people and then do more collaborations. My master's thesis was trying to understand how an object-based attention and representations were formed, and if they could be connected to the indexing theory, the indexing mechanism. So presumably, before you can have a representation of object, you have to be able to index it, be able to point to it before focused attention can be directed towards it in order to get more features and bind them together, and so you have like a more representation. So I wanted to see if we can get this object-specific preview benefit, which object file theory tends to use as a way for evidence for object file or object-based representations. I wanted to do it in dynamic MOT displays. So this is an example of the experiment I did for my master's. There's some objects are being primed with 2 letters. Your task is to remember the letters while tracking the objects that previewed the letters. So just remember what those letters are and then track those 2 as they move around. And at the end of the trial, when you see a letter, you respond whether that's the same or different. And what you find is when the same letter appears in the same object that was cued, so it's a matching congruent trial, you're responding much faster. So you're getting this object-specific preview benefit even in dynamic displays like this. And when you have to attentively track the targets that preview the letters, then you're going to have a faster response time. So it actually helps bind these features together. I still need to publish this paper, but this is what I did for my master's. Then I moved on to subitizing. And subitizing is the ability to enumerate or identify a small subset of items really quickly without having to count individually. So if I showed you that display, you could easily tell me you saw 4 objects, and that's about the limit of that. If I showed you this display, you would probably give me an estimate, which gets noisier when more objects are on the screen. So the idea is that when you're subitizing, what could be happening is that those objects are indexed, and you're able to notice the number of indexes that are active, and that's how you report the number really quickly and without much error. So what I wanted to look at was, since the indexing mechanism is a spatial mechanism, what kind of information is encoded when you are doing things like subitizing? And what we're finding is that you do get a pretty good localization, and really under really brief conditions, but with some systematic errors, which kind of looks like it's in the form of compression. There might also be a higher subitizing range, but that's debatable. But I can show you the experiment is basically this. I asked subjects to fixate at the center of the screen. Then 2 to 9 black discs appeared randomly, and they were randomly placed with about 3 degrees separation between each other so you don't have crowding effects. They were shown, for the first experiment I ever did, they were shown 50, 200, and 350 milliseconds. It was followed by a mask, and then observers used a mouse to click on the locations of those objects. So this pointing, by putting markers on the screen, they're giving an implicit response of the number of objects they saw, and also giving us an idea of how well they remembered the locations of the objects. So to look at the enumeration results, what you see is you get about the proportion of trials that were enumerated correctly on the y-axis, and display numerosities on the x-axis, which range from 2 to 9 in this early study. And what you see is that performance is really high, and it goes to about 5 or 6, and then it starts dropping after that, depending on how fast. The faster displays, the performance tends to drop a little quicker. So this is the performance with a 50 millisecond display. And when you're pointing to locations, the performance drops after about 5 milliseconds, after 5 objects, and you start to see the drop in performance. But when asking subjects on the same display, when I did a follow-up experiment, and asking them to report the number using this display where you had to identify the numeral that it was related to, you get the drop after 4, which is more of the standard subitizing range. So there might be some advantage to pointing to items that you don't lose, or that the capacity seems higher, and maybe that has something to do with having to convert to a verbal label. I like to think that words get in the way. But this still needs to be proven. What I was really interested in at this point was what kind of localization, or how much error do you get when you localize these objects. And on this figure, the results for this experiment, again, I have the display numerosity on the x-axis, and that magnitude of error is on the y-axis, so the higher up on the y, the more error there is. And you see that in the 50 millisecond condition, you have the most error, and it gets a little bit better as you see the displays a little bit longer. This data is for the first response made to a screen. So even in the first click that you make on this display, you're getting some effect of load. So the more objects you have to remember, the less accurate you're going to be. It's not a big effect, but it's a small effect. And so these are the basic results from that work. Just to give you an example of how people are responding. So these are actual trials. The blue dots are the stimuli on the screen. The red X's are the responses that the subjects made. And there's a centroid that kind of gives you the centroid of those two sets of coordinates. And what you see is that people tend to remember, the red's not showing as well, but you tend to remember the shape of the objects really well, but then there's a systematic compression that's happening. And it's happening around the centroid and not the center of the screen. So there is this relationship between objects that's very important in this representation of these different spaces, or indexed objects, let's say. And so that was my PhD work at Rutgers. After that, I went for a really brief postdoc with Fabian Mathy, who was here, I think, as a postdoc a year or two before I started. And we did more work to look at we did a couple of projects, but the one we did was to kind of look more about this encoding of spatial information in memory, and whether if you were allowed to look at displays even longer, would you get even better at localizing? And could you identify any kind of grouping strategies? Because maybe the slightly higher performances, because sometimes dots appear like in certain groups. Maybe you see 2 and 3 here, or 3 and 3 here, and you're able to do better because of that grouping ability. So that's the questions we wanted to ask. Do longer viewing durations increase memory, and are there any grouping strategies? So in this study, we did not find that longer viewing durations did any help to the overall localization accuracy, but you do get a reduction in spatial compression. So what we did here, so this is a localization accuracy chart. The pink and red lines are from the previous studies, the 50 millisecond, 200 millisecond displays, and the blue line is from this study where we showed the stimulus for up to 9 seconds, so depending on how many items were on the screen. So if there's 2 items on the screen, they saw the display for 2 seconds, 5 items, 5 seconds, and 9 was 9 seconds. So they're all displayed simultaneously, but all at the same time. And there is no marked improvement in localization accuracy. But what you do see is that, so this is a measure of spatial compression. Again, the display numerosities on the x-axis, the magnitude of compressions on the y-axis. So the higher up, the more compressions happening, as in people are putting the dots closer to each other, as opposed to what they were in the actual stimulus. And what you see is there's less compression in the long exposures. So even though you're not getting better localization accuracy per se, you're doing a little bit better in remembering how they are configured or how close they are to each other. Then I also did we did a clustering analysis to see if people favored certain clusters and responded to all those clusters and ignored some, as opposed to trying to, some other strategy to see if they were grouping the items. And we found that there was no evidence of a clustering strategy, even when looking at displays for a longer period of time. So that was a brief 3-month postdoc I did in France the first time. But we got 2 papers out of it, which is pretty impressive since I don't think I've been that productive since. Then I went to Australia to do a postdoc at the University of Western Sydney, where I worked in the foundational processes of behavior group. Mainly worked with Tamara Watson on eye tracking stuff, John Cass, and some implicit learning stuff. So I did more on the localization task and compression. I also did a study with one of my honors students on the relationship between multiple object tracking and reading abilities, and we're in the process of submitting this hopefully this week. And it's an idea. The idea, what we basically found is that the better you are at MOT, the better you are at reading non-words. So that's the main finding of that study. Yeah, well, it makes sense because it's like you're better at moving to novel things as opposed to reading, which might be a slightly different process. Anyway. And I also got into, then I kind of started going into this philosophical stuff down here, but I'll talk about that part later. So now looking at this spatial compression that we're finding in this localization task. It seems like whenever I show someone I work with the localization task, they're kind of intrigued by it and they want to do more research, even though I'm trying to learn something new. But, so I ended up looking at the, like what kind of, like if we could dissociate the kind of spatial compression that we're finding, because there is some evidence that when you hold something in memory, you tend to remember them being closer to each other. So maybe that's what's happening in these results. Or it could be that when you're making an eye movement, you get also that spatial compression that many studies have found in that sense as well. So we wanted to see if we could tease that out. Is the observed spatial compression due to working memory, or is it due to making an eye movement or a blink? So we find 2 sources of compression here. So I did the same exact task where you're shown number of dots, masked, and then you place the items on the screen. The only difference was there was 4 different viewing or eye movement conditions. The first one was a fixation only. You just looked at the center of the screen and you made the responses, a replication of all my previous ones. Next one, you're cued to blink by the disappearance of the fixation cross, and the experiment was programmed so that you would see the stimulus right before you had you actually closed your eyes. And then there was a saccade condition, or 2 saccade conditions. One, you make a saccade to the right, and one, you make a saccade downwards. And this was to see if that would increase the compression that we found. And again, when those fixation crosses disappeared, you initiated the eye movement, and the stimulus was presented just as soon right before you actually initiated the movement. That's where you get the most of the saccadic compression that we've studied and found. So what we found, so this is again the localization error with the magnitude of localization on the y-axis. The blink and the control condition down here were identical. So blinks seem to be really good at helping you remember space. And there was a lot more error in the saccade conditions, as one would expect. So to look at compression, this is also the magnitude of compression on the y-axis. you see that blinks had the least amount of compression, and then fixation only had the standard amount. And then we get more compression when you look at the saccade data. So I could go into more about the saccade data, but it gets really complicated. So I'm just going to show you sort of the distribution of errors to give you to show you how errors happen. So this chart, if you look at the center of the dotted lines, imagine that as being the center of its stimulus disk, and each of the little crosses, which are hard to, so each of the little dots all over the place, are someone's response to those dots. So in the top two, so in the fixation only condition, this one, you see that there's like kind of a normal distribution of errors. Same with blinks. In the saccade down, you see the distribution errors are up and down, and the saccade right, they tend to be smeared with the, the way that you're making the eye movement. And when we analyze this data, we get this sort of extra compression from this kind of error. So we found that we were claiming that there's two sources of compression, not only from the saccade, but also from what you hold, what's kind of inherent to this kind of display and this kind of response. That's one of the bigger, more interesting parts that I did in Australia. Now, I'm in a pretty funny place. I'm doing work now, working in Patrick Kavanagh's lab in the University of Paris, mainly with Patrick and Matteo Lisi, and also where I'm looking at the relationship between perception and action, basically. And I'm also doing some intersaccadic integration of information on this project that's about to start with Celine Pei. So to talk about the dissociation between perception and action, Matteo and Patrick published this paper last year where they show that the information that goes to your perception is not the same as the perception or the information that goes to making a saccade. And they use a double drift illusion to demonstrate this. I don't know if you're familiar with the double drift illusion, but I will show you. So just fixate at this dot. I don't know how well you'll get this illusion, but as I start the animation, yeah, so this perception is that it's not moving.
I saw the gorilla.
Did you? You weren't supposed to see the okay. So if you look there, you should.
Worm going across the
Yeah, I think that's just something with the projector. That has nothing to do with my study. But if you fixate there, you should see this should look like the Gabor should look like it's going straight up and down in your periphery.
Yeah.
Are you getting that illusion?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the actual path though is this. Because of the internal motion, you're getting this. This is called a double drift illusion. So what they did in their study was to ask people when they're cued to make a saccade to the last perceived location of the moving Gabor. And so the fixation cross would turn off, and then they would make the eye movement. The Gabor would turn off during the eye movement, and their eyes would land somewhere, and they measured that. So what they found is that there's two possibilities, that the saccades would land on the actual physical path, or the perceived path, which is up and down. And they did a lot of good controls where for each person they adjusted the level of the internal motion and the angle of the I don't know necessarily the angle of the tilt inside in order to get the best up and down perception. And what they found in the double drift illusion, the saccades landed closer to the actual physical path, which replicated their control that has no double drift. So this is kind of an argument they can use, that the information that's used for making a saccade, for making an action, is different than that for perception, which I thought was really cool, and I was kind of super excited about this paper when I read it, and I think my enthusiasm for it kind of got me in this lab. So what I wanted to do is to see if the sort of mechanism that's used for tracking, the indexing mechanism, is it closer, are we going to get more similar effects to that when you're making a saccade? Like, will it be immune to the illusion and you can still track without being fooled by it? Or is it going to be more like perception? Because if you are perceiving this incorrect trajectory, you're going to get much more mess-ups of your tracking. And our preliminary data show that MOT is not really affected by this, but I presented this at VSS, and I need to do more follow-ups. And my demo does not paste in here properly, but basically it's just 8 objects on the screen. A subset from 1 to 4 are being flashed, and you can track those objects, and then you click on the targets at the end of the trial. And the one I can run a MATLAB demonstration afterwards some other time if you guys are interested in seeing this. But the main thing, it does seem like that when you're tracking it with the internal motion, the trajectories are going a certain way, but then when you're tracking with the exact same motion, like the exact same trajectories, but without the internal motion, which is a control condition, the angles look much more steeper. So there is this weird perception thing happening, but you're still able to track without much error. So this is the overall results that I got so far. This is the number of trials with perfect tracking, or proportion of trials with perfect tracking. The blue line is a control condition, so the same stimuli but with no internal motion. And you do get some overall effect of a reduction in accuracy, because the red line is with the double drift illusion. The only one that's significant is the 4 object. But again, I need to do more work on this. So this ties into my interest that I kind of went into this philosophical world with Carlos. And partly because I was interested in philosophy early on. Like, I was interested in what it means to be consciously aware, and why we have, what enters awareness, and what contributes to that, or what determines that. So when I asked Zenon about this in 2005, when I was starting my PhD and kind of really excited about what I'm going to do next, Zenon replied with something like this: anyone who talks about consciousness has no idea what they're talking about. So naturally, Carlos and I wrote a book talking about it. This is the book available on MIT Press. Please buy it. We get 50 cents from every book, so it's helping me back there. So what we're looking for in this book is that what is the relationship between attention and consciousness based on the existing work, and trying to point the way for better research, we think. And our main argument is that they're mainly dissociated. You can't say they're the same thing, or that they're exactly this, or that they're completely different, because there's some overlap in conscious attention. So now I'll ramble about some consciousness stuff for a little while. So basic questions of what is conscious experience. This is a big problem in philosophy, a big question in philosophy. It's a very challenging, interesting question. And what's really interesting, why is it related, and how is it related to attention? So again, the common quote from William James, which I think every psychologist uses in one of their slides. So this talk about the ability to focus on one out of possible objects or trains of thoughts is clearly a reference to conscious attention. So it's not about the other kinds of attention that seem to be happening outside of awareness, but it's about conscious attention. And so that's why we think conscious attention is interesting. And why focus on visual attention while doing this? Well, I come from a visual background, but also vision has a strong phenomenal experience. It's naturally, it's very compelling. It's like a natural thing to talk about and to study. We have a very good understanding of the visual system, so might as well use that information. What's really important is that attention can be described functionally, which means there is an adaptive purpose for different levels of attention, or different kinds of attention. And then, of course, there's a range of theories that go from complete identity to full dissociation. But we think there's some level of dissociation, as most people's theories tend to inherently have in that. So this is a model I'm going to get to. How much time do I have? I'll explain each one. Just kidding. This is the model I like to use. Like, we'll start with simple circles with the different forms of consciousness and the different forms of attention. And then we'll try to make the bubbles kind of go overlap. This isn't the best visualization. There's other ways we can visualize this, and we have to do better ones. But basically, it's just a way of saying that we've outlined this in the book. You can have identity theories, or you can have type A dissociation, which is this low level of dissociation where you have where attention is necessary for consciousness, but there's only one form of conscious attention, so clearly the bubble's not perfect there. And then the other 2 levels, like attention is not necessary for consciousness, and vice versa, and there's one form of conscious attention or many forms of conscious attention. So the more dissociation you have, the more different independent forms of conscious attention you might have. And you can say they're completely different, no overlap. course, you need basic definitions. So what we do is try to say that, what we're using as consciousness is this basic subjective phenomenal experience of what it's like to be in a certain state. This generally needs to be reportable, although we might be able to have more conscious experience than what we're able to report, but it has to be accessible for report. Attention is the selective enhancing, filtering, or processing of information for the brain. This does not seem to be reportable, but it does feed into goal-directed tasks as you're functioning, as you're navigating, but you're not aware of certain things. It still works in the background. It's related to a type of cognitive agency. And what is conscious attention? So conscious attention is where they overlap. It's the having this phenomenal experience based on information that was processed in an attentive manner. And we can talk about this as visually voluntary, sustained attention, so like sort of object-based representations and binding. Having self-reflection, like effortless experience of flow is a conscious attention. And basically, the theories out there right now about consciousness are talking about conscious attention. So all these theories inherently talk about conscious attention, like global workspace or information integration and attention schema. So the interesting thing about conscious attention is that it is giving us an example of cases where consciousness and attention are happening at the same time. It seems to be required for some integration processes, especially when you're integrating complex information. It may play a crucial role in complex tasks, such as learning. And so by talking about conscious attention in this sense, we might be able to have a functional explanation of, we could probably give a functional explanation for conscious attention, and thus for consciousness. There's many studies out there that talk about the dissociation between consciousness and attention, and there are many examples, some extreme examples of blind sight, where you have damage to a certain part of your visual cortex, and you can't really see as well as you can perform on the objects that are in front of you. There are studies on backward masking, binocular rivalry, visual stability, and visual illusions. These also show a sort of a dissociation between what is attentively processed and what you're perceiving. And that study by Lisi and Kavanaugh that did that, how eye movements tend to not use the same information as what you perceive. So again, there's this dissociation between the two. And you can also consider, you can also talk about this dissociation by talking about the evolution of attention and possibly and when consciousness emerge. So we talk about this in this paper about, can evolution tell us more about the relationship between consciousness and attention? And we're saying yes, probably. So if you look at evolution, to understand consciousness is to look at it better would be to see if it's a recent adaptation in relation to attention. Again, attention has clear forms of functional purposes. We can say that, and it can be told through an adaptive story. But consciousness, it's a little bit more controversial to do that. But we can maybe use conscious attention as a way of indirectly getting at consciousness, or getting at consciousness and saying there is a functional purpose for it, possibly. So talking about the evolution of attention, really there has not been much out there. I don't know if we missed anything, but there really not many people talk about it. Ward seems to talk about it a little bit, Cosmides and Tooby talk about it a little bit in the overall cognition, but there isn't really anyone that's really specified how attention evolved and how it all fits together. But you can look at all the attentional systems in animals to get an idea. I mean, there's spatial navigation in insects that is a form of attention. They'll talk about selective attention in dragonflies, because when they're feeding, they have to fly in swarms and be able to pick out the objects that they are food, as opposed to the other ones that are not food, as in the case of their co-members. And birds have divided and selective attention, some studies have shown. So the key would be to try to identify which forms of attention in animals, if any, have conscious attention, and that's a pretty hard thing to do, but I think some people have laid out some theories, and I'm blanking on the names right now. So if we wanted to give a timeline for the evolution of attention, which Carlos and I try to do here, we could maybe put it from, signal detection is not necessarily, it's not a form of attention, but you can talk about the low-level selective sensory receptors, some sort of spatial memory or spatial attention, which includes indexings or indexes, are very early on, there exist in many insects and animals. It's important for being able to navigate in the environment, to be able to find food and prey. You have to have these forms of attention, including egocentric, animal monitoring, and then object-based attention is probably where it gets a little more complex. But you also need to have that to a certain level in most organisms. And then it becomes a little bit more complex forms of attention. So this timeline is just a suggestion. It's probably not the perfect one, but it's probably not that crazy to say something like this. Now, to do it for consciousness, it'll be a little bit more controversial. You could maybe say that axis consciousness came before phenomenal consciousness, but that's, it's hard to say. It really hard. But maybe self-awareness is like the higher level of consciousness, but still, it's not the clearest way to do this. But you can try and get criticized, hopefully. And then conscious attention is where the two merge. And the main thing we want to say here is that before you have to have these basic forms of attention first, before you can get to any kind of conscious attention. And that's the argument we're making in this. And if you look at the brain organization, you can also say that, well, the more basic forms of attention are closer to the older parts of the brain, while the more complex, more top-down versus reasoning and manipulating thoughts and stuff comes from the more recently advanced portions of the brain. They all involve some sort of recurrent processing that's important for identifying consciousness, is what people are saying. So some speculations on evolutionary purpose, if we want to make speculations. So my conscious attention seems to be important for learning, or some types of learning that are more complex or more very novel situations. So like imagine when you're first learning to play the piano, definitely it's more effortful conscious attention is required in order for you to be able to know how to interact with that new piece of instrument. But then over time it gets better, which turns into effortless attention, which is an interesting shift of how attentive processes work really effortfully at first and then become effortlessly, which is another area that is worth looking into. Also, some studies say that conscious attention is required for integration, even though some integration can happen outside of awareness. Some of it might be necessary to necessarily have awareness. Could be conscious attention could be something that helps an organism engage in its environment, say like when it's having a fear response in order to respond to the cues appropriately. Similarly, you can say that maybe the purpose of consciousness is to limit the amount of information that you're conscious of so that a lot of processing happens in the background and you're still able to do your complex interactions. This is especially probably true for humans. You're able to do your complex things without having to be aware of every single bit of information that has entered your brain in order to do those things, which would be overwhelming. And it may serve moral and aesthetic needs. So without having a theory of mind, morality probably would not have emerged. So just to sum up of this work, we think that attention and consciousness must be largely dissociated, and on our little scale, it's probably going to be a type C CAD. Even attention does have an evolutionary story, but it's still controversial to give one for consciousness. But if we talk about the evolution of conscious attention, that might help clarify some things about consciousness. And this likely appeared after the basic forms of attention. And I think the most productive research on conscious attention is related to learning or executing actions, especially if you can do them without awareness. Experiences of effortlessness, of how something shifts from being effortful to effortless. The idea of visual stability, having like this constant visual scene without it being jumping around all the time. What is that? How is that entering perception based on the blurred information that's coming through your eyes when you're making eye movements, for example? And visual illusions might be good to also use to test these ideas. Still far from like knowing exactly what subjectivity is, but I think this kind of work would help us better understand it if we ever will. I think we will. So Zenon influence. Well, clearly a lot of this work from object tracking to subitizing is this move into and trying to understand awareness is this, how does information move from very lower levels to more complex enriched visual experiences of our world. So his mentorship and guidance really provided the pointers for my research. Like everything I do somehow, I guess I didn't really think about it until I put this together. Everything I do basically has his theory, his work as a foundation for it, which I think is pretty cool. It's kind of like my Finst, I guess. And from low-level attention to higher-level perception and cognition, and maybe even consciousness maybe can be better understood through Zenon's theories. And the work that I'm moving into now, I'll continue to do this. Like eye movements and intersaccadic integration, which is related to visual stability, relationship between perception and action. Carlos and I are doing something on cognitive penetrability and how it is unlikely. So the Firestone and Scholl paper was really good to read. I read this a few days ago. Examining the evolution of consciousness and attention through emotional attention and linguistic attention is something we're looking at here too. Also doing stuff on AI, which is some of Zenon's earlier work. And I'm trying to subversively push indexing theory wherever I can. So all the people that I've collaborated with ultimately have some remnants of indexing theory. I think that one good example is when I was in Australia, I had to teach these little lab sections where you do like an experiment over a year and you write a report. These are the people that couldn't get into honors, but they basically do an honors thesis under complete direction by me. They don't really have any input. And basically I did MOT studies with them, or different versions of them. And they would start reading as in like, this is so weird, like why are you studying this? But so many people have told me after the fact, like, this is actually really cool. This is such a cool idea to think of the world in this way. So even undergraduates, if you show them the benefit of understanding how we connect to the world, they'll see it, even if they have no interest. Most of my students were like studying to be either teachers or clinical psychologists. So it's not like this theoretical stuff really is on their forefront, but it becomes more interesting after a while because it is kind of philosophical. And all this stuff on attention and consciousness, you can read more about it. This is like shameless self-promotion here, but Carlos and I are doing this blog at Psychology Today where we're kind of outlining these ideas, and it's kind of fun to do. So big thank you to Zenon. I won't get too sentimental here, but couldn't have done any of this without you, and Rux was great, and my many collaborators are here. There's more, but that's it. I think I did it in 10 minutes. Right? Questions, or should we just move on to the next one?
I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, and maybe Brian can get set up in the meantime.
Yeah, Susan? Yes? Move up here.
So my question is, how would you know whether a non-human animal has phenomenal consciousness?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So I'm trying to remember.
It's tricky.
I think it was Seth. Who does it? Who outlines it? Seth. Neil Seth. Yeah, there's some people. I think for me, it seems like maybe having tool usage must have some sort of reasoning there, and whether it's not. Yeah, I think it's really hard to decide phenomenal consciousness in animals. I really don't know. That's for the animals.
But you can't talk about it, you can't put it on, I mean,
Yeah.
you can't just say, you need it for X, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really wonderful, if you could figure out a way of addressing that question empirically, that would be great.
So I should do my research in that direction now.
Great is to win a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Well, I have one related, a serious question.
Yep.
So theoretically then, what does it mean to be a zombie?
Oh, that's what got me. That's what got me out of philosophy and into like psychology. So I don't know if I'm a good one.
I was trying to see, where is the zombie?
Yeah, I try to avoid zombies. I told Chalmers that and he apologized. So it's I don't have any thoughts on zombies. Yes.
Did you get any feedback? You mentioned teaching. Did you get any feedback from maybe some people that took, you were mentioning on how this, perhaps they were able to apply what they learned from you in the classroom?
Yeah, I think, they said that they do have ideas on maybe how attention works and how they could maybe use that to their advantage somehow, but I don't remember all the specific things. But, I mean, I think why they were really impressed was because it is relevant. Until some people may not realize it at first, but it's kind of what is relevant to understanding how the mind works and how people behave on that.
Okay, so everyone, we have one more talk before lunch, and we have a scheduled 15-minute break that we are not going to take.